Greetings and salutations. Welcome to our new podcast. Peter and I are going to have a series of conversations, a dialectic, if you will, in which we try to figure out what is going on in the world. And we're going to start, our inaugural theme is going to be censorship.
Well, John, thanks for getting this kicked off. And, I can tell you, I just came back from a conference, and the title of the conference was Uncanceled Censorship. I was actually deemed one of the most censored people in America, and I felt almost honored with that designation. Now, I'm not just a TV doctor, I'm a real doctor. And as a doctor, I've always felt a higher responsibility of conveying the truth.
You know, censorship was a foreign concept to the American constitutional republic. When I graduated from grad school in 1996, if you had asked me then, could you imagine a scenario in which a ranking medical doctor who has one of the most impressive peer-reviewed publication resumes in all of medicine, certainly in Peter's area of medicine, cardiorenal medicine, could you imagine him being censored for just trying to get at the truth of a novel viral disease infection? And how did this come about? And what has it prompted you to discover?
Well, the word censor means to suppress, to actually try to suppress information. Censorship is the act of it, and by definition, censorship occurs from basically persons or entities of authorities, governments, various organizations, colleges, the church, and it has a long-standing history. It goes back a long, long way.
Well, I think for me, having studied philosophy, I mean, you can't get away from the towering eminence of ancient Greece. And we get into the 4th century BC, the reign of Pericles. This is when we had Socrates, trying to get at the reality of the human condition. And in that civilization, during that golden period of these dinner parties, when they'd have these dialectical inquiries, free speech was explicitly not only condoned, but actually encouraged. But we see this kind of gravitational pull in human affairs where the Peloponnesian War starts to go the wrong way. There's this plague that comes to Athens in the midst of the Peloponnesian War. And under stress and duress, suddenly censorship starts to creep in. And we have this first really notable trial, the trial of Socrates, in which this great spirit of inquiry is found guilty of corrupting youth and impiety and actually put to death. And so this kind of kicks off a long, fraught history in Western civilization of this tension between a spirit of open inquiry, of liberal-minded inquiry, and this desire to censor and to suppress.
But isn't the desire to censor or suppress to try to reduce harm? There's a thought that if a particular utterance occurred or a particular paragraph was written, that if interpreted in some context could actually cause harm.
Therein lies the tension. I think what our founding fathers discovered is that there's a far greater risk of doing harm by not allowing inquiry, by not allowing discovery. And that's an interesting thing. I mean, we look at history, we look at the regimes of the past that did have this imposition of an authority, an orthodoxy meaning something like correct thought, and they became very uncreative, ossified places in which there wasn't really any advancement in culture or science.
Well, isn't it true that the church, for hundreds of years, the church decided what books would be printed and which ones wouldn't?
Yes, and it takes us into a dark period of church history when the Holy Office of the Inquisition was founded. And there are two really notable moments in history where the Holy Office of the Inquisition accuses two very important people in history. The first one was Giordano Bruno. He had proposed that Copernicus had, in fact, the correct perception of the cosmos, that the Earth and the other planets were going around the sun rather than the sun and the other planets going around the Earth. Giordano Bruno proposed this. Copernicus was actually right about this. He was accused of heresy by the Holy Office and burned to death on the Campo dei Fiori in Rome.
Well, I got to tell you, Socrates had to drink poison. He was burned at the stake. I can tell you, as a doctor, in a time of controversy now, doctors in my circle and scientists in my circle have genuine concerns that history could repeat itself. Is it possible?
Well, isn't it? I mean, hasn't this been your personal experience? I mean, we're trying to evade this, our own new modern set of censors. What I think is fascinating about the current period is, we all grew up, particularly the guys in Silicon Valley. I mean, their favorite film was Star Wars, about the Rebel Alliance, battling it out with this overarching empire. Or Blade Runner, how, if you were on the wrong side of the Tyrell Corporation, a Blade Runner would come after you to execute you. The killer bots of the show Terminator. And yet, here we are in this almost dystopic moment in American history where guys like you and I are sort of having to speak in cipher in order to avoid being censored on certain platforms.
Well, it's an important conversation to have, because in the field of science, let's just take scientific inquiry, there are two major lines of thinking or methods. One is deduction and one is induction. Deduction is when we start out with a law. A law is proposed, the law of gravity, and it is tested over and over again. It's found to be true, 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 and we can rely on the law of gravity. We can have planes fly in the sky basically working on the principles of physics. There are laws of physics. In medicine, when we're studying the human body, or in veterinary medicine, we're studying animals or microbiology, there are no laws. We actually don't have laws. We actually apply some laws of physics, by the way, to cellular action, like laws of thermodynamics and various laws of chemistry, but we use what's called inferential thinking. Inferential thinking is we actually don't know the truth, and by observation, by testing associations, by investigating mechanisms of action, we ultimately slowly work towards arriving at the truth, but we don't really know the truth. And so that process in medicine, it's essential that we don't discount any of these possibilities, because we have what's called, what T.S. Kuhn said in 1968, and his book was wonderful on this, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, we have paradigm shifts. And medicine is clearly one of the prima facie examples of paradigm shift.
Well, yeah, you see this with the germ theory of medicine in the mid-19th century. I mean, what we now just absolutely take for granted, that cholera is spread by bacterium in the drinking water, by contaminated drinking water. Or there was another famous moment in history, this professor in Vienna, Ignaz Semmelweis, who observed that students in anatomy class, working with cadavers in anatomy class, they shouldn't just go straight to the maternity ward and start performing gynecological examinations on pregnant women. At the time that Semmelweis made this stunning proposition, it was considered heretical. He encountered all manner of resistance amongst Europe's medical authority, and he ended up dying alone in an insane asylum. At the same time, Dr. John Snow in London, they kept having these cholera outbreaks. And Dr. Snow says, I figured this out. It's contaminated drinking water. Shut down these contaminated wells. And the public health authorities in London said, you're nuts. So it becomes this titanic battle to take the handle off the well in Soho that he's figured out through these different forms of observation and reasoning, it's contaminated. It was only 30 years later that Robert Koch, the bacteriologist in Germany, vindicated snow. So we're hoping that it won't take 30 years for you to be vindicated.
Well, you know, these observations and these events in history were not powerful technological advancements. They were made through careful observation, reasoning, testing, just like Mendel, who put together some of the first concepts of genetics by studying little pea plants in his garden. What we have today is a complex reality where observation really matters. And so if at any time, we are clearly in a time of controversy, my personal view is we should be having as much discussion or dialectic as we possibly can. Now, is there any example in history where censorship is a good thing?
I really can't think of one. I mean, if we think of medicine, so I think what we're confronted with now is those who wish to censor invoke the American frontier past. They say, well, these medicine showmen, they traveled around the plains of North Dakota or something, selling mineral oil or dirty water that they got out of the creek or whatever, and claiming that it's some kind of panacea. And what we're seeing now is, in order to prevent the snake oil salesmen of the past, we have to impose from Washington, D.C., an orthodoxy. And if we don't impose that orthodoxy, then the public can be harmed. This is a massive deception and confusion. I mean, obviously, the medical profession today is not going to regress. That is to say, an inquiring, inquisitive medical doctor with modern academic training is not going to regress to offering all kinds of unproven creek water therapies.
Well, even if a medicinal agent could cause harm, it would do so by direct toxicity. And the toxicity would be way worse than the condition that it would be treating. So if we had a potentially fatal illness that came down on the population, and it was known to be fatal,
right,
and people became sick, and over the course of several weeks, they ultimately died, and the majority died in the hospital. If such a condition existed, the only thing that could make it worse would be something that's directly toxic and gives them no chance of survival. Anything else that reduces the intensity and duration of symptoms, that reduces the anxiety of having a potentially fatal illness, even if it was a placebo, if that ameliorated this proclivity to end up in the hospital, and then the hospital, the next step, and the next step, because the natural history of any disease is the disease itself, but also iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis is complications that can occur once we start doing things, particularly in the hospital.
Well, to speak really directly to this point, I mean, you were called by what for a long time was known as America's newspaper of record. You were called in an op-ed one of the medicine showmen of the U.S. Senate, or excuse me, snake oil salesman of the U.S. Senate. Now, what's notable, so there's this distorting, gross comparison with the frontier past. What the op-ed propagandist did not mention is none of you guys were talking about anything that wasn't already FDA approved for other conditions. Everything that you advocated and that you proposed as a treatment modality had been FDA approved, had been observed being deployed on millions of people for decades. So this was just a gross expression of pure propaganda.
So censorship has a connection to propaganda.
Yes. And so those who are making a good faith attempt to figure out what the hell is going on are by the propagandist. Oftentimes these two actions occur together. Those who are making a good faith effort are suppressed, and the worldview that is trying to be offered in the place of honest inquiry is being propagated.
So I'm in a position of authority. I want the population to do this. You stand down and be quiet and listen to what I am saying. Censorship, propaganda. It's very important. Cannot have an alternative view, cannot have it, because I have something to say, and what I have to say as a government or an agency or a college or a orthodoxy, if you will, what I have to say is false. What I have to say is vulnerable. What I have to say, the concepts that I am putting forward are erosive. Erosive means they can actually melt away if someone has a countervailing view.
That's right, and I think it's notable that, for example, Giordano Bruno and Galileo, I mean, they were ultimately vindicated. I mean, I think the church was a little bit tardy in admitting this. I think it was Pope John Paul II, 400 years later, who finally came out and said, well, Bruno and Galileo were correct. So what we would like to see is a willingness to accept inquiry, to accept skepticism and discussion, and not have to wait 300 years to get an acknowledgement of it. There's another point in this that I think should not be overlooked. We have this thing called normalcy bias, and I started off by saying I graduated from grad school in 1996. At that time, all of the censorship was unthinkable. No one would have even proposed such a thing. I grew up in the tradition of John Stuart Mill, the great liberal philosopher of 19th century England, his marketplace of ideas. Fight it out, present different points of view, debate it, and in the end, as we look at it and examine the data and the observations and everything else, the better ideas, the ones that are more closely conforming to the reality of the situation, are going to win. The other point is this censorship is almost invariably accompanied by extreme ineptitude, by incompetence. We joke about this. The North Korean regime insists on this strict orthodoxy. And if anyone questions the great leader of North Korea, he's placed in front of an anti-aircraft cannon and blasted to smithereens. But look at North Korea. The country is starving to death.
Mm-hmm. So it's important that it's not an action against the North Korean government. It's actually just a thought or a spoken
Correct.
word. So the idea is strike first before the action ever happens. That person can never commit an act of treason because we're going to strike them down just based on their words. So it's preemptive. So some of this severe form of censorship is preemptive. Now, the United States was born, in a sense, as a new experiment, a new liberal democracy, free of censorship, although there have been episodes. Mark Twain's book was censored by the library in Concord, Massachusetts. There was a Library Act that said we are going to curate. We are going to look at what's in libraries and make sure that it's appropriate. And even to this day, our Federal Communications Commission has some standards, right? That something is get rated X or rated parental consent, what have you. Doesn't some censorship play a role in terms of appropriateness, what children can see, etc.?
Well, our Supreme Court has been hesitant to censor. What our court has considered is something that should probably not just be freely disseminated. Notions of obscenity, pornography, it could be corrupting, particularly of children, direct incitements to violence. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there isn't one. And encouraging criminal actions, incitement of criminal conduct. During the First World War, Oliver Wendell Holmes made a ruling about a complaint, a contest over the Espionage Act, in which the complaint against a socialist agitator named Charles Schenck was that he was endangering national security. Oliver Wendell Holmes's ruling on this has been debated by legal scholars for years. Was it good jurisprudence, or was it a needless erosion of the First Amendment? I mean, we could debate about that, but he did at least provide a standard, real and present danger.
Well, let's talk about that in modern terms. 2021, we have the Super Bowl. What if the National Football League said, you know what, fill up the stadium, we're good. It doesn't really spread this way. We can all watch Tom Brady try to win with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Does that cross the line?
Well, this raises another point. I mean, don't you think that humans are actually, if they're not being propagandized by watching television, if reality is not being presented to them electronically and terrifying them 24/7, don't you think they're actually kind of sensitive to, is there actually a danger that affects us if we talk about risk groups? We talk about the risk stratification of this problem that we've had for the last 2 years. I mean, one thing that's notable is we're being told that even young athletes were susceptible to this lethal virus. No young athletes were dying of SARS-CoV-2.
We have a situation now where there's roughly 250,000 published papers, 250,000 on the current crisis. Scientific papers, cited in the National Library of Medicine and PubMed, cited. And so initially, there was just a handful of papers. And then it grew and grew and grew. So the knowledge base changed. And I would say when we didn't know, be cautious. When we didn't know, we're not really sure. We're not sure how people are falling ill and ending up in the hospital. Let's be cautious. But the more we knew and the more we understood, then there should have been this progressive enlightenment. And a milestone in the current crisis was the Great Barrington Declaration. This is a declaration. This will go down in history, written by Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, some of the three most heralded institutions in the field of medicine. And they said, you know what? We know enough now that only the vulnerable need special protections and special measures. Everyone else should go about their business as they normally do. That came out roughly third quarter, fall of 2020. The Super Bowl was in 2021. Now, as I recall the Super Bowl, where Tom Brady did win with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they had just a few token people in the stands. It was anemic. And what I said is that people who had recovered ought to be given credit for their recovery. They've been through this illness, that they ought to go celebrate. Matter of fact, we had so much relief money, they could have bought them each a hot dog and a beer and enjoyed the game. So what happened over the course of history, and it was more severe in other parts of the world than others, that through acts of censorship, and censorship would apply to the Great Barrington Declaration. Censorship would apply to statements that liberalized things. And on the other side is, well, we need to be cautious. We're really not sure. Let's not say anything that could put individuals at risk. And it kept going month after month. And people started looking, well where is the emergency? So censorship in the current controversy has played a great role. And the question on the table is it actually censorship that's doing harm? And is it now possible that censorship has cost human life?
Well, I think certainly. I mean, it's like I said, when I talked about Semmelweis and John Snow, a lot of pregnant women would have been spared dying of puerperal fever. I mean, he wrote this in letters to his colleagues. You guys keep suppressing what I am telling you, even though at this point you know damn well that what I'm telling you is perfectly logical and supported by the observational data. And yet you insist on doubling down, so all of these girls are dying in maternity wards.
So doubling down in medicine. In Mukherjee's first book, called The Emperor of All Maladies, of which actually won the Pulitzer, Mukherjee is a fellow at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. He writes about lung cancer. And the lead surgeon, who had been the most expert surgeon in taking out the cancers, one by one. In fact, he was smoking as he takes out the cancer because he was convinced smoking was not related to cancer. And he took out more cancers and took more cancers. And the dialogue and the discussion, epidemiologists were observing this. You know, isn't smoking related? The air is going into the lungs. The air is not normal. It's smoke. Could smoke actually stimulate one of these tumors to grow? It wasn't that far of a leap of common sense that breathing something other than fresh air could actually induce a lung cancer. And he doubled down and he tripled down. And he himself, in the end, died of lung cancer.
Yeah, but I mean, at a certain point, I mean, when you're talking about a guy like this, I mean, it does raise profound questions about just how bizarre human psychology can get. I mean, the thing, and we'll talk about this in our episode about propaganda. The tobacco industry was a really notable example in history of how techniques of propaganda that were really refined and developed during the First World War. Some of the key propagandists in the American propaganda office during the First World War then became madmen. They became Madison Avenue ad guys. The most notable was a guy named Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He did a massive propaganda campaign for the tobacco industry to systematically obscure the evidence that tobacco is harmful. And this combination of suppressing anyone who raised his hand and said, but maybe this smoking is a bad habit, maybe it causes cancer, that with all of this propaganda really created one of the most harmful episodes in American history that lasted for decades with millions dead.
You see, I think smoking is a good example in terms of obviousness. When patents are written, for something to be patentable, it has to be non-obvious. And there's actually a criterion for this. Obvious, it should be obvious that the air going into the lungs is not fresh air. It's smoke going into lungs. The example of Semmelweis is different. It wasn't obvious that something was on the hands, right? Because they couldn't see it. It wasn't obvious. And through my career, I lived through a paradigm shift, and it happened with peptic ulcer disease. Right here in Dallas at Parkland Memorial Hospital, where I trained, the leading surgery done when I was on surgery was a vagotomy and pyloroplasty 2. That was a resection of part of the stomach and the small intestine because of a stomach ulcer. We took out case after case after case, and in fact, we had a situation where it was learned it was completely unnecessary. It was caused by a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. Great example of something not being obvious.
We could go on about censorship forever, but I think our first episode is drawing to a conclusion. Thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about humor as a form of nonconformity and protest. We're going to talk about propaganda. There's lots of fun stuff to come.
Thanks.